Hello there, Caf P here. Or at least this is the best self-portrait I can manage drawing directly onto my tablet. Whoops. I'm demisexual and probably bi as well, and I suppose this is my coming out video. For the most part, I'm a pretty private person, hate putting labels on myself for the sake of others, and don't really think this is anybody's business. However, it's also occurred to me that if it took me as many years as it did to come this far towards understanding myself, then maybe there are other people out there like me who might benefit from feeling seen. Maybe hearing my experiences will help them put to words the way that they are a little sooner than it took me to come to the same conclusion. And for me, that's worth opening up a little bit of my soul. So here we are. What I want to stress in this video is how important it is for consent-based sexuality to be shown and taught in all its diverse glory, to minimize the number of people like me who take decades to realize who they are and waste time trying to find their place in a rigid social system that doesn't care about their individual needs and experiences. I want to preface this by pointing out that in my case, although I truly believed for a long time that I was asexual, I'm not sure now that I actually ever was. Asexuality, the lack of sexual attraction to people, is real and manifests in many forms, but in my story I was struggling so hard to find out how I worked and what worked for me, and at the time, asexuality was the only definition I had outside of heteronormativity and mainstream ideas about performative hypersexual queerness. But we'll get to that later. Let's start with some definitions, and then go into why it took me so long to get to a point where I understood and felt comfortable to identify myself under those definitions. So, here are some of the words I'm using in this video for the sake of clarity. Being bisexual, or at least as far as I understand it, is to have romantic or sexual attraction towards people of more than one gender. As our definitions for gender are slowly changing, there are plenty of people who use the terms bisexual and pansexual interchangeably, choosing the term which sounds the most right in their mouths at the time, although many also insist that they're separate things, and some even swear that bisexual, as opposed to pansexual, is a bigoted or even transphobic term. As for me, I just really like androgyny and a good sense of humor, and as it turns out, I don't really care about a person's gender if I think they're cool. Moving on, to be demisexual means that you do not really experience sexual or romantic attraction at all, unless you already have an emotional connection with that person and know them well. This often translates to a series of long-term romantic relationships with good friends. For this reason, I've never in my life been on a date. It's much too fast for how I work. I don't even know that we'll get along as friends. The added pressure to consider the possibility of romance when I know I will feel absolutely nothing towards you for at least a few months of continuous contact isn't really something that either of us should have to suffer through. And when people hear this about me and try to become friends with me in the hope that eventually I'll fall for them, well, prepare to be friend-zoned, because I see your keenness and it scares the shit out of me, as well as any potential for romance. Over the years, friends have jokingly called me a serial monogamist, a prude, and someone who takes relationships too seriously to really let go and have some fun. What I am, as I'm so grateful to understand now, is demisexual. Alright, so let's start my story with middle school, because talking about my relationship with sex as a child is not really something I feel comfortable sharing yet. Nothing particularly bad happened to me, don't worry, it's just give me some privacy at least. Anyway, by middle school, I already understood a few things about sexuality, based on my own feelings and what I knew from my parents, saw in the world and media around me, and was taught in school. 1. Me being sexual is bad. 2. Seeing overt displays of sexuality, either in person or in the media, makes me feel deeply uncomfortable or even panicky. 3. You can be heterosexual or homosexual, and being homosexual is something scary to be avoided. As middle school progressed, I made friends, and over long periods of time I developed a few crushes. The boys I crushed on were short, had nice hair, and pretty faces. While I admired them from afar, though, I wasn't especially interested in any kind of relationship with them. I saw how relationships played out in the schoolyard, and it all seemed pretty upsetting to me. For me, though, those crushes were enough to convince me that I wasn't homosexual. And I was somewhat relieved whenever I got those crushes, because every so often I became terrified that I might be falling in love with my best friend. A girl! Whatever me and my friend had was never sexual, and I was still young at the time and a late developer. I never even thought about wanting it to be sexual. All I remember was a deep affection and longing that I had for her as a person. Even now, I still don't know for sure if that was really a romantic attraction. Media portrayals of women's sexuality with each other tend to be either dismissed as friendship or overblown and hypersexualized, often directly geared towards a straight male audience. Romantic love between women is still largely confined to the shadows, and to me, although I felt a stronger kinship with this girl than I did with my other good friends, I don't think I will ever know whether I was actually in love with her. This friend moved interstate at the end of middle school, and our friendship gradually drifted apart as we became different people. I had no reason to blame her for any of that, but well into my university years, I continued to see it all as a deep betrayal. I think she might have broken my heart, but honestly, I don't know. All of my romantic relationships with men over the years have developed out of similarly deep or deepening friendships, and in hindsight, I struggled to see how my feelings in this case were different. I've become close friends with both men and women since middle school, and I've only developed feelings I describe as romantic around a few of them. She was the first. To date, I've only ever pursued those feelings with men, though, because that felt more like what I was supposed to do, you know? I kept dismissing those same feelings with women as friendship, even when it became the kind of friendship where my heart occasionally skipped a beat when I heard from them, or the kind of friendship where I became overly anxious about the possibility of them seeing something extra when they looked into my eyes. That's friendship, right? That's how I chose to view it, though. I'd project my own confused feelings onto them and make myself worried that my women friends were falling for me instead, and that I shouldn't do anything to give them the mistaken impression that I was crushing on them. That sounds ridiculous saying it now, but it's really only in the last year that I even realized I'd been doing it. More on that later. So, anyway, from late high school, I started having relationships. I don't really count my first boyfriend, even though we were technically together for 2 years. He lived in the US and I never met him in person. It was all online, and yeah, we started as friends. We also basically just shyly flirted with each other from afar for 2 years. I ended up falling more deeply for another online friend later on, and I actually did meet this one a few times, even though he also lived on another continent. We were together for 3 years, which brings us to university. Around this time, I learned about the existence of bisexuality as a concept because my sibling came out as bi after identifying as lesbian for a while. I'll admit I was rather dismissive about their initial coming out because I'd seen and heard them crushing on men my whole childhood, and a big part of me assumed their lesbian phase was largely to annoy our parents. But then when they were bi, it made sense again in a really horrible way. I say horrible here because it opened up that old possibility to me again. It made me think about my best friend from middle school, and it made me feel uncomfortable. By that point, I realized that queerness was fine, of course, and I had no problem with the idea of non-heterosexual attraction in other people, but I was confused again about what that meant for me and who I was, or at least who I believed myself to be. A little while later, my own partner came out to me as bi, and I reacted terribly. I got angry at him. To me, it felt like for him to come to that understanding, he would have had to have betrayed me romantically in some way. I felt like he must have been promiscuous and would be promiscuous in the future, that because of his sexuality, just me would never be enough for him. Sound familiar? This is a common accusation leveled at bi people, and I threw that at the person I loved in what would have probably been an intensely vulnerable moment for him. I'm honestly surprised he didn't leave me then and there, but somehow we plowed on for another year after that before we broke up. Years later, as I slowly grew to understand what bisexuality actually was and meant, I started to realize that what I had done that day was one of the worst things I'd ever done. And by some miracle, when I apologized to him in person for my words 10 years after the breakup, he actually accepted the apology. As you can see, the term bisexual and my understanding of it is something I've only very slowly grown into throughout my life. It was just not something people acknowledged for most of my youth, and if so, not really in a positive or even neutral sense. My own sexuality only got more confused as I started to navigate the world as a young adult and saw that nothing about sexuality gelled for me. This is where my painfully slow journey from asexual to demisexual comes in. I felt like a freak in romance for most of my life until I discovered the word demisexual a few years ago, around the ripe old age of 30. Growing up, the stories and experiences I shared with others about how love and romance work for me never seemed to resonate with them at all. Even as early as high school, I'd say, I'm asexual, except when it comes to my partner at the time. And they'd laugh at me. It does actually sound pretty silly, really, but I guess in that era, I was just conjugating a new word from existing grammar, and I wasn't aware at the time that asexuality was actually a way that people could and did experience attraction. On top of my general, but not total lack of romantic feelings, the weight of social anxiety and the sense of reluctant obligation I felt in the company of people who did feel immediately attracted to me wasn't something my friends experienced in quite the same way either. Not to mention the sexual frustration from having a high sex drive, which I probably could have dealt with in a number of ways, but didn't because the acts would have made me feel intensely uncomfortable and disgusted. My friends definitely didn't understand that. Complicating this further, the way the media looks at and promotes sexuality as being some kind of primal instinct that everybody just has always frightened me a lot, especially as it pertains to gender roles in these situations. The way that I saw men and women interact was often predatory on the part of men and submissive or yielding on the part of women. It felt like women and men never just had fun with each other. It was always either complicity with or a reaction to established gender norms. Every act of intimacy I was subjected to in the media and on the street, even in ostensibly niche circles like kink, looked like it was part of some kind of self-aware acknowledgement of the gendered status quo, and it really turned me off sex in general because I didn't want that dichotomy in my life. On top of this, every depiction of queer love I was subjected to in the media was from a hypersexualized perspective, especially in portrayals of intimacy between two women. I never really saw queerness depicted on TV or in film without overindulging in gratuitous sex, often casual in nature and always catering to a straight male gaze, tastefully shot for the male couplings, and downright exploitative the moment women were involved in any capacity. Vapid songs like I Kissed a Girl by Katy Perry also didn't help in this regard and gave me a skewed and unhealthy idea of how navigating my sexuality would be perceived. It felt like for me to get genuine respect, I would have to be non-sexual, regardless of any desires I had. As a result, what I experienced of the media and society's domineering views on sex and sexuality set me back a long way on my journey towards understanding myself, because I concluded early on that the issues that I had were due solely to society's ills and not also the way I personally experienced desire and love. In the same way that I externalized the possibility that I might be bisexual by projecting my uncomfortable feelings onto the subjects of my affections and turning it into them longing for me, I rationalized my discomfort with attraction in general by putting it in the hands of society alone. If I'd had any guidance at all, any precedent of someone else feeling the same way, any understanding that this was a thing, I might have been able to distinguish between society's problems and my own worldview a lot more easily, and I would probably have enjoyed my relationships to this point a lot more, or at least selected my partners a lot more wisely. My first really serious relationship lasted for 5 years, and even though we went to university together, we actually grew close online, in keeping with my previous relationships. The internet was a great way for me to break through my then debilitating social anxiety and meet new people with similar interests. Physical distance also allowed me to suss people out over time without feeling pressured to have any obvious physical attraction towards them. This was not a conscious courting habit of mine, by the way. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't have any words or strategies to navigate my comfort within romantic settings, and this just ended up being what worked for me every time. I honestly can't think of a single intimate relationship I've had which didn't start with an online component. Maybe you can relate. This partner, well, although I can say I truly loved and cared about him, unfortunately for him, as it turned out in this case, although we were close friends, I didn't really desire him in the way he desired me. That isn't to say I didn't have desires at all. I just didn't feel like I had anywhere to direct them towards because I was scared of the societal implications that seemed to come along with being intimate. It felt like anything sexual I did would have been a concession to oppressive ideas about gender. I also didn't feel like I experienced desire in the same way as the people around me, including my partner. I felt safer in general when I wasn't doing anything at all, even though the frustration ate away at me unrelentingly. Despite the libido roaring inside me constantly, I felt at that time like I must definitely be asexual, because I didn't want my partner or even anybody else I knew in that way. He was never intimidating or bad to me in intimate situations. He just wasn't the one for me. But I guess having concluded earlier that I was asexual, I thought that an intimacy-free life was just how it was always going to be with me. And with our love, we saw out those 5 years relatively happily. I tended to dismiss my difficulties with falling for people as something to do with trust issues. That's not to say that I don't have issues with trust at all, but I didn't really have many reasons to have such trust issues in the beginning, besides my general discomfort with how people interact in romantic settings. I struggled for so many years trying to reconcile the fact that I experienced desire in an abstract sense, but found everything I understood about sex to be disgusting and degrading to me. It's only really been in the past 5 years or so since my breakup with that previous partner that I've really been able to grapple with this fully and to really enjoy intimacy. And as it happens, I'm pretty good at it too. Maybe being pent up and scared for 25 years is just the kick you need to spice up your love life. No. Besides the complex and systematic process of unlearning everything that heteronormative society taught me about love and romance, a big part of the progress I've made has been learning the language I need to communicate how I experience attraction with myself and others. If you're straight and conventionally sexual, you have a roadmap for intimacy reinforced constantly by your friends, family, and the world around you. It's a problematic roadmap, yeah, but at least you can model your own path based on this general layout. We're slowly starting to reach greater understanding and acceptance of non-heterosexual romance as well, even though it is still very largely marketed as a monolithic hypersexual orgy of free love. One more step we really need to grapple with in education and beyond is how love can work when you don't really feel attraction at all, or when you can feel attraction but only under very narrow circumstances. Not because it's impossible to learn about who you are without having your hand held every step of the way, but because it can really save time and unnecessary anguish or confusion. It is such a gift to understand both that A, the way you experience consensual attraction is not necessarily the way that most of the people around you experience it, and B, regardless of how uncommon the way you experience consensual romance is, you're not a freak, and you're most definitely not alone. The easiest way to reach this understanding is for those roadmaps and examples to be presented to us as we're growing into ourselves, through formal education, through modeling by the people around us, through depictions and positive representation in media and popular culture. For example, I can imagine that BoJack Horseman's Todd Chavez realizing that he's asexual over the course of his character arc would have made many people feel seen, regardless of whether it was a perfect depiction of asexuality or not. His journey might even have turned on a light bulb in some people's heads as they finally figured out the words to describe their own feelings about romance and intimacy. These media depictions don't necessarily even need to depict the struggles and turmoil that might come with the territory of non-conventional sexualities. Just unabashedly existing is often the best start to broadening the conversation. So, through this long and winding journey within myself, I went from asexuality to demisexuality by becoming aware of language that fit my experiences and realizing after almost 30 years that I wasn't alone in them. But how did I finally figure out the other thing, the probably bi thing? Well, last year I was in a restaurant chatting with a friend about relationships, and at some point we ended up talking about sexuality in general. By this point, I was no longer a child who believed in binary sexuality, that you could either be straight or gay and nothing in between. I no longer thought that to be queer was something to fear, or a guaranteed path to hardship and anguish. I no longer believed that I was asexual, and I no longer believed that mainstream gendered attitudes about sexuality and sex acts had to apply to me and impede my enjoyment of intimacy. I was completely out of excuses for myself. As my friend and I discussed our own approaches to romance and attraction, what started out as me giving reasons for why I probably wasn't bisexual ended up with me coming out to both my friend and myself as probably bisexual. Given that I'm also demisexual, it's even more clear to me now that being bi isn't a declaration of your own promiscuity. Having the potential for attraction to people of more than one gender isn't a statement on the frequency of your attraction. It's obvious, really, in the same way that me enjoying intimacy now isn't a statement that I want to be intimate with as many different people as I can. There's nothing wrong with wanting that either, of course, but it's not cause and effect. But anyway, I digress. What I think is important to point out with my awkward coming out experience is that I don't believe everyone necessarily has to have a so-called experimental phase to figure out which way or ways they swing. Not everyone needs to have had experiences with people of different and the same genders to know if they're bi or anything else. To date, I've only ever been in relationships with cis men. That's definitely made it a little harder for me to learn about myself and why I still say I'm only probably bi. But what I'm trying to get across here is that my lack of experiences with women and beyond isn't proof of my sexuality, and it doesn't make me any less queer than if I went out with someone of a different gender every night. Would I like to know how different it might be to be in a relationship with someone who isn't a cis man? Of course I would. We know what cis men are like. But I'm not going to force something I'm not feeling. And the way that I work, I simply don't feel anything towards anyone most of the time. I suspect that a big reason why I've only been with cis men is related to the fact that I tend to have a lot of interests that are dominated by cis men, and hence befriend and grow close to them more frequently, and not necessarily because I'm only attracted to cis men. Being demisexual has made it more difficult to come to the conclusions that I have about being bi, and I do wish that society and education were structured in such a way that my realizations and personal growth could have happened much earlier on in my life. But I'm just so happy I got here in the end. I'm so much more comfortable in myself and in relationships the more I know who I am. Coming out to friends is an interesting concept. For me, at least, nothing changes. I've been working on my truth by myself the whole time. The only difference is that now you know my truth because I chose to share it with you. By the time someone comes out to you, they have probably, for the most part, already come to terms with who they are. You're presented with a near-finished product, which may have taken years of inner turmoil to produce. You don't see the journey because you're standing at the finish line. From there, you can either accept what is presented to you, or you can reject it. And honestly, in many cases, compared to our feeling of self-acceptance and comfort in ourselves, your approval of who we are is just a bonus. What's most important then is to have the tools and language provided to us such that we can figure out who we are, without wasting so much of our lives being afraid of the answers, without struggling to relate to others and trying to make ourselves fit into a mold that will never work for us, without feeling alone with our feelings and desires, or indeed the lack of desires we have. Society can help, media can help, education can help, and I hope my video has helped someone as well. So, there you go. That's my story, and this is who I am. If you've watched all this and at the end of it have decided, oh wow, I think I have a crush on Cav P now, I should tell them about it. I completely understand the feeling. However, I highly recommend you watch this video again because you may have missed the whole demisexual thing I've spent half the video explaining. On the other hand, maybe there are some of you who saw a little of yourself in this story. I hope that you know that you're not alone and you're seen. It's never too late to realize who you are, but the sooner you do, the sooner you'll know what you need to look after yourself. I'm Cav P, and I am so relieved to say that I'm demisexual.